In the year of our Lord 1665, London was not a city, but a tomb in the making. The Great Plague had descended like a suffocating shroud, turning the vibrant arteries of commerce into silent, fetid canals of human misery. A pervasive miasma, a thick cocktail of Thames River rot, the cloying smoke of herbal pyres, and the inescapable stench of the overflowing plague pits clung to every cobblestone and every soul. The air was a heavy, tangible thing, punctuated only by the incessant funereal tolling of church bells that no longer marked the hour, but merely tallied the dead. In this sprawling necropolis, where death was a certainty and suffering the only prelude, hope was a currency more precious and far scarcer than gold. It was a time when science was a fragile candle flickering against a hurricane of superstition, and men looked for saviors in the most desperate of places. Amidst this panorama of decay, one figure stood as a beacon of stoic resolve, Dr. Alistair Blackwood. His reputation preceded him, a whisper of calm competence in a city screaming with panic. Within the walls of his study on Cheapside, a world of meticulous order defied the chaos raging outside. Polished mahogany shelves held leather-bound books of anatomy and philosophy, arranged with geometric precision. The air here was different, scrubbed clean of the city's stench and replaced with the sharp, antiseptic aroma of carbolic acid and dried botanicals. It was in this sanctuary of science that Dr. Blackwood began his nightly ritual. He would lay out his medical bag, its velvet lining a stark crimson against the dark wood of his desk, and begin to pack. His instruments, many of them strange and innovative designs from the continent, were his pride. Gleaming scalpels, complex syringes of brass and glass, and polished steel clamps were cleaned and arranged not just with care, but with a form of reverence. Each click of metal against metal was a sharp, deliberate sound in the heavy silence, the methodical preparation of a craftsman who saw his work not merely as a profession, but as a sacred, inexorable duty. His hands, steady and pale, moved with an unnerving grace, selecting each tool for the grim work ahead. His destination this evening was the home of a prosperous merchant in the Cornhill ward, a man whose wealth could purchase every comfort, but could not build a fortress against the pestilence. Inside the grand house, the opulence was contaminated by raw, primal fear. Tapestries seemed to absorb the sounds of weeping, and the air was thick with the labored breaths of the merchant's only son. The boy, no older than 10, thrashed in his sweat-soaked bedsheets, his body contorted by the agonizing advance of the buboes, his feverish cries echoing through the cavernous rooms. The family stood by, helpless, their faces masks of anguish. Into this scene of despair walked Dr. Alistair Blackwood, a figure of profound and unsettling calm. He approached the bedside, his expression unreadable, and after a brief, efficient examination, he turned to the desperate father. His voice, low and measured, carried an absolute authority as he uttered the words that had become his signature promise. The suffering is immense. I can and I will provide him with a definitive peace, a promise that carried a chilling, unspoken finality. Later that night, long after the doctor had departed, a profound silence descended upon the merchant's house. The boy's tormented cries had ceased. His struggle was over. When the family crept back into the room, they found him lying perfectly still, his features relaxed, almost serene. There were no signs of the final, violent convulsions that so often accompanied a plague death. There was only a placid stillness, an unnatural tranquility that was both a blessing and a deeply unsettling mystery. In the days that followed, the merchant's grief was tinged with a strange and profound gratitude. He spoke of Dr. Blackwood, not as a mere physician, but as an angel of mercy who had answered their prayers, swiftly and painlessly ending an agony that had become unbearable to witness. He had not saved the boy's life, but he had, in their eyes, saved his soul from further torment. This story, whispered from one grieving family to another, began to build the doctor's legend. His remedies were faster, his methods more final, and his results more peaceful than even God's will seemed to allow. To understand the full weight of this legend, we must step away from the 17th century and into our own. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of modern London, down a narrow alley that the city's relentless march has somehow overlooked, lie the skeletal remains of a brick building. This is all that is left of Dr. Blackwood's clinic. The roof has long since collapsed, and ivy snakes its way through the empty window frames, but the place retains a palpable atmosphere. It has become a dark landmark, a focal point for local ghost stories and a pilgrimage site for those fascinated by the city's macabre history. The structure itself is not what draws them. It is the lingering narrative, the tale of a doctor whose compassion may have been a mask for something far more complex and terrifying. The cold, damp stones seem to hold a memory, a silent testament to the countless last breaths that were drawn within its walls, each one administered with a physician's steady, calculating hand. The ruins are a monument to a question that has never been fully answered. The whispers that haunt this alley are not of a violent poltergeist or a vengeful phantom. Instead, the legend speaks of an unnerving quiet, a pervasive and unnatural peace that is said to settle over visitors who stand too long within the crumbling walls. Locals call it Blackwood's silence. They speak of the ghosts of his patients, not as tormented souls but as placid, listless figures who wander the site, their passing having been so swift and devoid of struggle that they seem untethered from the violent emotion that typically binds a spirit to its place of death. Tour guides and paranormal investigators tell the story of the merciful doctor, a man who defied the plague with his own brand of definitive cure. The story concludes, more often than not, with the central, chilling paradox. Was Alistair Blackwood a monster playing God? Or was he, in a city with no hope, the only true compassion to be found? The answer, it seems, is buried with his secrets. The legend of the merciful doctor is an echo that has traveled through centuries, a historical anomaly that blurs the line between healing and homicide. And since these stories of the past find new life in the present, we ask you to mark your place in this timeline. Tell us in the comments from which city you are joining us in this investigation, and the exact time on your clock. With your presence now recorded in our own ledger, let us turn the page back. We must return to the London of 1665, not to the end of the doctor's story, but to its beginning, to witness the arrival of a man who would first admire Dr. Blackwood, and then become the first to notice the terrible, silent pattern hidden within his miraculous cures. The first crack in the doctor's flawless facade was about to appear. Into this crucible of faith and fear stepped Reverend Thomas Hale, a young Anglican priest, newly assigned to the blighted parish of St. Giles in the Fields. He was a man whose unwavering belief in divine providence was about to be tested by the stark machinations of man. He arrived in London with a heart full of pious duty, intending to be a shepherd to a flock being decimated by the plague. His mission was spiritual, to administer the last rites, to offer a final comfort to the dying, and to guide their souls toward the light. He saw the city not as a lost cause, but as a great and terrible field in which the strength of one's faith could be truly measured. The physical decay all around him, the scent of death that was the city's new perfume, was merely a temporal trial. The true battle, he believed, was for the immortal soul, a battle he was prepared to wage one prayer at a time. His duties soon brought him into the orbit of Dr. Alistair Blackwood. Their first meeting occurred at the threshold of a tenement, Hale arriving to administer last rites as Blackwood was departing. The priest was immediately struck by the doctor's aura of command. Amidst the filth and panic, Blackwood was an island of dispassionate science, his clothes immaculate, his mannerisms precise. Hale initially saw in him a kindred spirit, another soldier fighting on a different front of the same war. Where Hale tended to the spirit, Blackwood tended to the flesh. He admired the doctor's tireless energy, his apparent immunity to the despair that had consumed so many, and the reports of his miraculous efficiency. In a city where most physicians had fled or fallen ill, Blackwood remained a stoic pillar of logic. Hale offered a respectful nod, seeing a man of medicine doing God's work in his own secular way. In those first weeks, Reverend Hale became intimately acquainted with the true face of the Great Plague. His days were a ceaseless procession of deathbeds, each one a new tableau of human agony. He witnessed the disease in all its horrific manifestations, the violent fevers that boiled the mind, the blackened buboes that erupted with searing pain, and the final, racking coughs that stole the last vestiges of breath. The sounds of a plague death were unmistakable. The guttural cries, the desperate gasps for air, the weeping of helpless families. Death was a brutal, ugly, and noisy affair. It was a violent tearing of the soul from a body that fought until the very last moment. This grim reality became Hale's baseline, his understanding of the natural, albeit terrible, course that the pestilence ran. It was a standard against which all other deaths would soon be measured. The first deviation from this standard occurred in a small weaver's cottage. Hale was summoned to the bedside of an elderly woman, whom Dr. Blackwood had just attended. The priest braced himself for the usual scene of torment, but was met instead with a profound and unsettling quiet. The woman lay in her bed, her hands folded peacefully on her chest, her expression serene. The family, though grieving, expressed their immense gratitude for the doctor, who had given her a painless release. Hale found the scene profoundly strange. It was a death without struggle, a departure so gentle it felt almost choreographed. He knelt and offered his prayers, but a seed of cognitive dissonance was planted. He recorded the event in his personal journal as a rare and merciful passing, an anomaly he attributed to a moment of divine grace, not yet to the hand of man. But the anomaly soon became a pattern. A week later, a dock worker Blackwood had treated died with the same placid expression. Then a young mother. With each instance, the scene was the same. A visit from the doctor, followed swiftly by a death devoid of the usual agony. The families were always grateful, the narrative of the merciful doctor growing with each unnaturally peaceful end. Reverend Hale, a man trained to look for signs and meaning in the fabric of existence, could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. The consistency was too perfect, the tranquility too uniform. His clerical mind, accustomed to the unpredictable nature of both life and death, saw a design. In the margins of his diary, his entries shifted from theological wonder to a specific, troubling question. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away, but the timing of these departures seems to follow the doctor's carriage, not God's will. Is it piety to ease suffering, or hubris to schedule its end? The turning point from intellectual query to visceral dread came on a damp, foggy evening at the Wapping docks. Hale was called to the side of a dying mariner, a man whose weathered face told tales of a life spent battling the sea. Dr. Blackwood had just completed his visit, leaving behind a small vial of tonic for the pain. Hale knelt, the familiar stench of tar and brackish water mixing with the odor of sickness. He leaned in close to administer the last rites, and the sailor's eyes fluttered open. With a rattling breath, he managed to whisper the words that had become the doctor's unofficial eulogy. The doctor, he brings peace. But as the sailor uttered the phrase, his eyes, suddenly wide and shockingly lucid, locked onto Hale's. They held no peace. They held a raw, bottomless terror, a silent scream of a man trapped within a body that could no longer fight. Then, the light faded, his expression frozen in that final, horrifying contradiction. That single moment shattered Reverend Hale's perception of the world. The sailor's terrified gaze was a ghost that would not leave him, a silent testimony that directly contradicted the grateful whispers of the bereaved. Peace did not wear a mask of abject horror. Mercy was not delivered with an undercurrent of silent violation. The juxtaposition was too stark, too monstrous to ignore. He now understood that the silence in Dr. Blackwood's wake was not the peace of a soul departing gracefully, but the silence of a struggle that had been artificially, prematurely, and perhaps terrifyingly, suppressed. From that point forward, he began to see Dr. Blackwood not as a man of science, but as an agent of something else entirely, a force that was imposing its own unnatural order on the sacred chaos of life and death. His suspicion now a burning coal in his gut, Hale's observations grew more focused. He recalled a detail from a brief meeting at the doctor's clinic a week prior. After a formal discussion about a parishioner, Blackwood, in a rare moment of personal pride, had invited the priest to see his private conservatory. It was a glass-walled annex to his study, a humid, verdant world away from London's grime. The doctor pointed out various herbs, feverfew, lungwort, chamomile, explaining their palliative properties. But Hale's attention was drawn to a singular, arresting specimen, cultivated in a special pot, apart from the others. It was an exotic vine with lush, dark green leaves and delicate, bell-shaped flowers of an unusually deep, almost black purple. Blackwood gestured to it with a reverence that bordered on obsession, calling it his most precious acquisition. The doctor's explanation of the plant's purpose was delivered in his usual calm, measured tone, yet his words were laden with a chilling ambiguity. He referred to the plant, which he called Aconitum tranquillitas, as his panacea for intractable suffering, a solution for pain that resisted all other remedies. He spoke of its remarkable ability to grant a swift quietus and release the spirit from its failing corporeal prison, phrases that sounded more like the lexicon of an executioner than a healer. With a glint in his eye, he mentioned that it was sourced from a remote mountain region on the continent, where local lore claimed it was used in final rituals for the honored elderly, ensuring a passage without struggle. To Hale, the clinical language failed to mask a nefarious philosophy. Reverend Hale departed the clinic that day with a profound sense of foreboding. The image of those dark, bell-shaped flowers was now inextricably linked in his mind with the sailor's terrified eyes. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to assemble themselves into a grotesque picture: the unnaturally peaceful deaths, the terror masquerading as relief, the doctor's philosophical justifications for a final cure, and his obsessive cultivation of a plant known for its role in death rituals. While the rest of London lauded Dr. Blackwood as a saint, a miraculous healer in a time of despair, Hale now saw the shadow that lurked behind the facade of the merciful physician. He did not yet have proof, only a collection of terrible portents, but he knew, with a spiritual certainty that chilled him to his core, that he was standing on the edge of an abyss, and that he was the only one who had dared to look down. The fragile normalcy that Reverend Hale clung to was destined to shatter, and the breaking point would be a young woman named Eleanor Vance. Residing in a modest but well-kept home near Aldgate, she had been struck by the plague weeks earlier, but hers was one of the rare, celebrated cases of a seeming recovery. Dr. Blackwood himself had declared her fever broken, and the worst of the pestilence past, a pronouncement that spread like wildfire through the grim city, a desperately needed sliver of light. Eleanor's fiancé, a shipwright named Daniel Croft, a man whose hands were more accustomed to the certainty of wood and iron than the vagaries of faith, had allowed himself to hope. He saw the color returning to her cheeks and heard the strength returning to her voice. To him, and to the neighborhood, Eleanor was a living testament to Blackwood's skill, a miracle in a time of relentless tragedy. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky the color of lead, that Dr. Blackwood paid what he announced would be his final visit to Eleanor. He arrived with his customary air of quiet authority, his black leather bag a familiar sight at their door. Daniel greeted him with genuine gratitude, watching as the doctor performed a cursory examination. Blackwood nodded, his expression one of professional satisfaction. "Her constitution is strong," he stated, his voice a low balm. "I will provide one final restorative tonic to ensure her strength does not falter. It will help her sleep deeply and awaken with renewed vitality." With that, he administered the contents of a small syringe into a cup of water, which Eleanor drank without question. The visit lasted no more than 10 minutes. It was clinical, reassuring, and utterly unremarkable. The silence that followed was not immediate. Daniel sat with Eleanor, speaking of a future that now seemed possible again, of the ships he would build and the life they would share. She grew tired, her eyelids heavy, and he attributed it to the doctor's promised restorative sleep. He left her side only for a moment, stepping into the small kitchen to heat a broth for when she awoke. The house was quiet, filled with a peaceful anticipation, but when he returned to the room not a quarter hour later, the peace had curdled. Eleanor was not sleeping. She was gone. Her body lay in the exact serene posture Hale had seen before, a placid mask on her face that betrayed no struggle, no pain, no final gasp. The hopeful warmth in the room had been replaced by a sudden, glacial cold. The tonic had brought a sleep, but it was one from which she would never awaken. Unlike the grieving families before him, Daniel Croft was not grateful. His heart, so recently buoyed by hope, was now a stone of cold fury in his chest. Eleanor was not suffering. She was recovering. This was not a merciful release. It was an inexplicable theft. The doctor's narrative, which had comforted so many, rang hollow and false in his ears. His practical, logical mind, trained to see how things fit together, could not reconcile a recovery with such a sudden, placid end. He paced the small room like a caged animal, his grief twisting into a sharp-edged suspicion. He replayed the doctor's visit, the quick injection, the promise of deep sleep, and then he remembered a fleeting look in Eleanor's eyes, a shadow of fear she had tried to hide when he mentioned the doctor's special medicine days before. Consumed by a certainty born of love and loss, Daniel sought the only other person he could imagine entertaining such a dark thought. He found Reverend Thomas Hale in the echoing nave of St. Giles, the priest's solitary figure kneeling in silent prayer. The shipwright burst through the heavy oak doors, his clothes disheveled, his face a mask of raw desperation. He did not come seeking solace or absolution. He came with an accusation. "He killed her," Daniel choked out, his voice a ragged tear in the holy silence. "Blackwood, he said she was getting well." Hale rose, his heart lurching with a terrible sense of validation. The shipwright's words were the thunderclap that followed the lightning Hale had seen in the dying sailor's eyes. It was then that Daniel delivered the final damning piece of testimony. "She told me." She whispered it. "I fear his peace more than the plague's fire." Eleanor's words were the key. They unlocked the last door of doubt in Hale's mind. The sailor's silent terror, the unnatural quiet, and now a victim's own confessed fear. It was a trinity of evidence against the doctor's sainthood. The patterns were no longer circumstantial. They were a clear and terrifying design. Hale knew he could no longer stand by as a passive observer, recording his doubts in the margins of his diary. He had a duty not just to God, but to the dead and to the living who sought justice for them. He placed a steadying hand on Daniel's shoulder, his expression hardening from one of priestly concern to that of a determined conspirator. Under the pretext of offering final prayers for Eleanor's soul and assisting the bereaved fiancé, Hale agreed to return with Daniel to the house. His parish duties would now serve as a cover for a far more perilous investigation. They re-entered the small home on Aldgate Street, the air now thick with the unmistakable stillness of death. The room was just as Daniel had left it, Eleanor's form still lying on the bed, an effigy of tranquility. While the shipwright slumped into a chair, his face buried in his hands, Hale began his grim work. He moved about the room, murmuring Latin prayers, his fingers tracing the sign of the cross in the air. But his eyes were not on the heavens. They were scanning every surface, every shadow, every corner of the room. He was a forensic investigator cloaked in the robes of a priest, searching for a single, tangible clue that could corroborate the monstrous truth he now felt in his bones. The oppressive orderliness of the scene, the lack of any sign of struggle, felt less like a peaceful passing and more like a meticulously cleaned crime scene. As he knelt beside the bed, ostensibly to offer a final blessing, his hand brushed against the dark, heavy wood of the bed frame. His fingers, tracing the dusty floorboards beneath, closed around an object. It was small, cylindrical, and cold to the touch. With his back to Daniel, he carefully palmed the item and drew it from the shadows. He held it in his fist for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs, before slowly uncurling his fingers. It was a small glass vial, no bigger than his thumb, of the kind an apothecary might use for a potent tincture. It was utterly unmarked, designed for anonymity. He held it up to the waning afternoon light filtering through the window, convinced it would be empty. He was almost right. It was not empty. Clinging to the curved glass at the very bottom was a single, glistening droplet of liquid. It was perfectly clear, thick like oil, and it shimmered in the dim light with an unsettling brilliance. It was a tear of pure artifice. Hale brought it cautiously to his nose, but there was no scent, no herbal fragrance, no acidic tang. It was nothing, and yet he knew with absolute certainty that it was everything. This tiny, clear drop was the physical embodiment of Blackwood's peace. It was the vehicle for his definitive cure. It was the poison that silenced the struggle, the chemical that froze the terrified scream in a victim's throat. Here, in the palm of his hand, was the truth, distilled into a single, terrifying drop. Hale's hand closed around the vial, the cold glass a stark contrast to his now burning skin. He slipped it deep into the pocket of his cassock, the weight of it feeling immense, like a sacred and terrible relic. He rose and met Daniel's gaze across the room. The shipwright's eyes, red-rimmed with grief, now held a new light, a cold, hard glint of resolve. No words were needed. The unspoken pact was sealed in that moment of shared, horrified understanding. Hale's spiritual quest had irrevocably transformed into a criminal investigation. They were no longer just a priest and a mourner. They were two men bound by a secret, pitted against a celebrated physician who held the city in his thrall. The shadow of suspicion had finally solidified into the cold, hard reality of a hunt. The age of miracles was over. The search for proof had begun. With the vial of clear liquid burning a hole in his pocket, Reverend Thomas Hale initiated a new, clandestine chapter in his life. Under the flickering light of a single tallow candle, his personal journal, once a place for theological reflection and private prayer, was repurposed into a grim instrument of forensic accounting. He began with Eleanor Vance, his quill scratching furiously across the vellum. Eleanor Vance, age 22, he wrote, declared recovering, visited by Dr. A. Blackwood at approx. 3 p.m. Tonic administered, deceased by 3:30 p.m. No struggle noted by fiancé. Utter tranquility. He worked backwards, dredging his memory and parish records, transforming vague unease into a damning chronicle. Each entry was a cold, hard stone laid upon the foundation of his suspicion, a meticulous ledger that charted not the course of a plague, but the terrifyingly efficient schedule of a predator hiding in plain sight. The list grew night after night, a chilling litany of London's forgotten dead. John Hemlock, a sailor, age 45. Mary Firth, a seamstress, docs, age 19. The two young sons of a baker on Fleet Street. For each name, Hale recorded the date, the time of Blackwood's final visit, and the impossibly brief interval before death was announced. He began to visit the bereaved families again, under the guise of offering continued spiritual support, his true purpose to collect their testimonies. The same phrases echoed in every home: a blessing, a merciful release. He didn't suffer. Hale would nod, his face a mask of pious empathy, while his mind superimposed the image of the mariner's wide, terrified eyes over their words of gratitude. The peace they described was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion, and this journal was becoming the sole repository of that monstrous truth. Secluded in his sparse room at the rectory, the act of writing became a heavy burden. The ink seemed to bleed into the parchment like a spreading stain, each name a fresh wound on the page. This was no longer just a log. It was a catalog of silent homicides, a secret indictment against a man the city revered as a saint. Looking over the growing list of names, Hale felt a profound and terrifying isolation. He was the sole keeper of a truth so dark it felt like a contagion in itself, a secret that, if revealed without irrefutable proof, would see him branded a lunatic or a heretic. The scale of Blackwood's work was becoming clear. It was not a series of isolated incidents, but a systematic, philosophical application of death, carried out with the precision of a master craftsman. He was not just fighting a man, he was confronting an ideology. Realizing his log of circumstantial evidence was not enough, Hale knew he needed to understand the weapon itself. The single, clear drop in the vial was a ghost he could not identify. His thoughts turned to a reclusive figure on the fringes of London's medical world, Master Elias Thorne, an apothecary of the old school. Thorne's shop, hidden in a labyrinthine alley off Gray's Inn Road, was a place most modern physicians shunned. He was a botanist who trusted ancient texts over the new sciences, a man known for his encyclopedic knowledge of herbal poisons and his profound disdain for the arrogance of men like Blackwood. To approach Thorne was a risk. The old man was notoriously paranoid and secretive, but Hale knew that if anyone in London could give a name to Blackwood's panacea, it would be the city's forgotten master of botanical secrets. The apothecary shop was a descent into another century. The air was thick with 1,000 conflicting aromas, the bitter tang of dried roots, the sweet perfume of resins, and the musty scent of decaying parchment. Jars filled with murky liquids and desiccated things lined the shelves, their labels written in a crabbed, esoteric script. From the shadows emerged Elias Thorne, a man who seemed as ancient and brittle as the herbs he sold. Hale, choosing his words with immense care, did not speak of murder or suspicion. He framed his inquiry as a matter of academic curiosity, a request from a clergyman intrigued by the intersection of botany and theology. He described a rare plant he had seen, detailing its dark bell-shaped flowers and the claims of its owner, that it could provide a swift quietus for the terminally ill. As Hale spoke, a flicker of recognition, then sharp contempt, crossed Thorne's withered features. He did not speak, but turned and shuffled towards a towering bookcase, from which he pulled a massive, leather-bound tome. Its spine cracked and its pages yellowed with age. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light as he laid the book on a counter and began to turn the fragile pages, his long, bony finger tracing lines of Latin text. He stopped at a page dominated by a detailed, hand-colored illustration. It was the plant from Blackwood's conservatory, rendered in exquisite, terrifying detail. Thorne's finger tapped the name written beneath the drawing. It was not Aconitum tranquillitas, the gentle, fabricated name Blackwood had used. The ancient text identified it with a far more brutal name, Aconitum funestus, the deathly wolfsbane. "This is no instrument of mercy, Reverend," Thorne rasped, his voice dry as rustling leaves. He explained that the concentrated extract, which he called the widow's kiss, was a legendary neurotoxin. It did not bring a gentle sleep. It induced a complete muscular paralysis, while leaving the mind horrifically aware. The first muscles to fail were those of the diaphragm. The victim, unable to draw a breath, would suffocate over the course of several minutes, fully conscious, trapped inside a body that had become their own coffin. The placid expression so many had mistaken for peace was, in fact, the final, frozen mask of that silent, internal struggle. "They do not pass peacefully," Thorne concluded, his eyes boring into Hale's. "They drown in the air of their own bedchamber, their last moments in agony we cannot imagine." The apothecary's words struck Hale with the force of a physical blow. The truth was infinitely more cruel than he had conceived. Blackwood was not a misguided angel of mercy, offering a quick, painless end. He was a torturer of the highest order, inflicting a final conscious agony upon the most vulnerable, all while accepting the gratitude of their loved ones. The sailor's terrified eyes now made perfect, horrifying sense. He had not been afraid of death. He had been experiencing it, right there in front of the priest, unable to scream, unable to signal the torment consuming him. Hale left the apothecary's shop staggering, the world around him seeming to warp and distort. Every toll of a church bell now sounded like a death knell for a victim who had died not of plague, but of a monstrous, deliberate cruelty. Meanwhile, Dr. Alistair Blackwood, a man whose success depended on his keen observation of human weakness, began to detect a discordant note in his carefully composed symphony of death. He started noticing the young priest, Thomas Hale, appearing with increasing frequency in the periphery of his work. He saw him not just at deathbeds, but lingering in the streets and alleys near the homes of patients he had recently cured. The priest's gaze had changed. The initial look of respectful admiration had been replaced by a cold, analytical scrutiny, the look of a naturalist studying a dangerous specimen. Blackwood, who prided himself on his ability to read men's souls, recognized the unmistakable signs of a hunter. The priest was no longer just a shepherd. He was tracking him. The doctor's suspicion was cemented during an encounter in a squalid room where a fever-ridden tailor lay dying. Blackwood had just administered a palliative dose when Reverend Hale entered, his timing almost too perfect. Instead of immediately beginning his prayers, Hale approached the bedside and, with a disquieting directness, began to question the doctor about the nature of the medicine. He asked about its origins, its composition, and the specific mechanism by which it brought such rapid relief. His questions were too precise, his vocabulary too clinical for a simple clergyman. Blackwood answered with a barrage of dismissive medical jargon, but he understood the true nature of the interrogation. This was not a quest for knowledge. It was a probe, a search for a weakness in his armor. The game had changed. Blackwood knew that a direct accusation from Hale, even without proof, could be disastrous. Suspicion, like the plague itself, was a contagion that could spread rapidly through the fearful populace. He had to act first, not to eliminate the threat, but to neutralize its credibility. He requested a private audience with the Lord Bishop of London, a man he knew to be deeply conservative and wary of the emotional excesses of his junior clergy. Blackwood arrived not as a man accused, but as a concerned party, a pillar of the community worried for the spiritual health of a young priest. He masterfully framed his case, using the church's own language and anxieties as his weapon. He was not there to complain, he explained, but to seek guidance for a soul he believed was in peril. With a somber and convincing performance, Blackwood painted a portrait of Reverend Hale as a devout but fragile man, cracking under the immense strain of his duties. He spoke of Hale's unhealthy fixation on the physical details of death, suggesting the young priest was blurring the line between divine mystery and morbid curiosity. He recounted, with feigned reluctance, how Hale had begun to frighten bereaved families, whispering of unnatural forces and interfering with the course of medical treatment. By positioning himself as a man of science and faith being troubled by a burgeoning zealot, Blackwood turned Hale's investigation into evidence of his instability. He concluded by humbly suggesting that a less demanding parish, away from the city's endless death, might restore the young priest's spiritual equilibrium. The bishop, a man predisposed to trust a respected physician over a junior cleric he barely knew, was thoroughly convinced. Reverend Hale was summoned to the episcopal residence a few days later. He arrived hoping for an ally, but instead found a judge. The bishop did not speak of murder or poison. He spoke of spiritual pride, of the dangers of seeing Satan's work in the simple course of nature, and of the sin of questioning the good works of reputable men. Hale tried to protest, to explain the patterns, the vial, the apothecary's testimony, but his words were dismissed as the frantic ramblings of an overwrought and grieving mind. He left the grand residence stripped of his credibility. The door to any official inquiry slammed shut and bolted. He was utterly alone, branded a zealot by the very institution he served. Blackwood, having successfully poisoned the well of authority, decided it was time to deliver a more personal message. He orchestrated what appeared to be a chance meeting, intercepting Hale as the priest walked through the melancholic quiet of the St. Giles churchyard. Surrounded by the weathered tombstones of generations past, the doctor approached, his face a perfect mask of compassion and concern. "Reverend Hale," he began, his voice low and soothing, "I have worried for you. The burdens you carry are immense. This city of death can weigh on a man's soul, leading him to see shadows where there is only light." The condescension was a suffocating cloak, each word a subtle turn of the screw, reminding Hale of his powerlessness. Blackwood was playing the part of the benevolent victor, offering false pity to his defeated foe. Then, the doctor's demeanor shifted. The mask of concern fell away, revealing the cold, hard certainty beneath. The feigned warmth in his eyes was replaced by a flat, reptilian stillness. "But a man must know his place in the divine order," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with menace. "Your domain is the immortal soul, a matter of faith and prayer. It is a noble calling." He took a step closer, invading Hale's personal space, the faint antiseptic scent of his clothes a jarring presence among the damp earth and decaying leaves of the graveyard. He was no longer offering a warning. He was delivering a command, an ultimatum from one self-proclaimed power to another. "Leave the flesh to men of science," Blackwood concluded, his voice as sharp and precise as one of his own scalpels. "The body, its ailments, and the manner of its final departure from this world of suffering, that is my domain. You are a shepherd, Reverend. Tend to your flock's spirits. Should you continue to trespass into the realm of the physical, you may find your flock mysteriously diminished." The threat, though veiled in metaphor, was chillingly unambiguous. He was not just warning Hale to stop his investigation. He was threatening the lives of his parishioners, the very people Hale was sworn to protect. The doctor had just declared them potential subjects for his next merciful cure. Hale stood frozen amidst the tombstones, the doctor's final words hanging in the cold air like a death sentence. The threat did not cow him. It ignited a fire of cold, righteous fury within his soul. The fear he had felt was burned away, replaced by a terrible clarity. This was no longer simply a matter of exposing a murderer. Blackwood's monstrous hubris, his explicit claim of dominion over life and death, was a declaration of war against God himself. He had confessed, in his own arrogant way, to the very heresy Hale had suspected. He saw himself not as a physician, but as a rival deity, a Thanatos in a physician's coat, and he had just threatened to use his power to silence the priest. The priest returned to his small room, the walls feeling as though they were closing in. He was an outcast, discredited by his superiors and now directly threatened by the killer he sought to expose. The formal avenues of justice were closed to him. The bishops saw him as a fanatic. The city magistrates would laugh at a story of a miracle-working doctor and a vial containing a single, unidentified drop of liquid. Master Thorne, the apothecary, was too fearful and reclusive to ever testify publicly. He possessed a moral certainty, but no legal proof. The system had failed, utterly and completely. To bring Blackwood down, he would have to abandon the rules that had governed his entire life. He would have to step out of the light of the church and into the shadows where Blackwood operated. His eyes fell upon the secret journal lying on his desk. Its pages were a silent testament to the dead, a chorus of victims who had been granted no voice. He ran his finger down the list of names until he found it. Daniel Croft, shipwright, the man whose grief had not been tempered by gratitude, the man whose raw, angry suspicion had first mirrored his own. In that moment, a new path forward became clear. Justice would not be granted from on high. It would have to be seized from below. He could not fight this battle as a priest, bound by protocol and hierarchy. He had to fight it as a man, allied with another who had lost everything. He would seek out Daniel Croft, and together, they would do what no one else dared. They would break into the lion's den and steal the truth from his very hands. Under the shroud of a moonless London night, a pact was forged not in a church, but in the sawdust-strewn workshop of a man whose faith had been shattered. Reverend Hale found Daniel Croft there, surrounded by the inert tools of his trade, his grief having cooled into a hard, dangerous resolve. The shipwright was no longer a man adrift in sorrow. He was an anchor of pure and cold fury. Hale did not speak of divine justice or heavenly retribution. He spoke of evidence, of entry points, of a ledger that had to exist. He presented the plan not as a priest proposing a sin, but as a co-conspirator seeking an accomplice. Daniel looked up from the wooden hull he was shaping, his eyes meeting the priest's. He simply nodded, picking up a heavy iron pry bar from his workbench. Words were unnecessary. Their shared purpose was now as solid and real as the tool in his hand. The city was a ghost of itself as they moved through the streets, a thick, suffocating fog swallowing the sound of their footsteps and clinging to their clothes like a damp shroud. It was a landscape of muffled coughs and distant, mournful bells. They reached the alley off Cheapside, where the doctor's clinic stood as a dark monolith against the gray miasma. The building felt colder than the surrounding stone, emanating a palpable stillness, a void of sound and warmth. Daniel, a man who understood structure and weakness, surveyed the building with a professional eye. He ignored the door, moving to a side window. With the quiet, expert motions of his trade, he slid the tip of the pry bar into the seam of the window frame. There was no splintering crash, only a soft groan of stressed wood and a quiet pop as the lock gave way. A sound swallowed instantly by the oppressive fog. Slipping through the window, they found themselves plunged into the heart of Dr. Blackwood's world. The air inside was shockingly clean, scrubbed of the city's stench by the sharp, sterile perfume of carbolic acid and botanicals. In the single beam of their hooded lantern, the clinic was a tableau of obsessive order. Medical instruments lay in precise rows on velvet cloths. Books were aligned with geometric perfection on their shelves, and not a single speck of dust seemed to mar the polished surfaces. It was the immaculate lair of a predator, a space designed for meticulous, unhindered work. The silence here was different from the silence of the fog-bound city. It was the profound, unnatural quiet Hale had come to recognize. The vacuum left behind after a life had been systematically and silently extinguished. It was the sound of Blackwood's success. The search began in a tense, shared silence. Daniel, with his practical mind, started with the physical, tapping walls and testing floorboards for hollow spaces. Hale, driven by his knowledge of the doctor's psyche, moved to the study, the intellectual heart of the operation. Their lantern cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced on the walls, making the familiar objects of a scholar's room, globes, charts, anatomical models, seem sinister and alien. Every drawer they opened, every book they pulled from the shelf, was done with a heart-pounding slowness, the fear of imminent discovery a palpable presence in the room. They were searching for a single flaw in a world built on flawless control. A single secret in a space designed to have none. The room held its breath, guarding its master's secrets with a sterile indifference. It was Daniel's eye, trained to spot imperfections in wood and joinery, that found the flaw. Behind the doctor's imposing mahogany desk, a section of the ornate wall paneling seemed just slightly different from the rest. The grain of the wood didn't quite match, and a nearly invisible seam ran along its edge, too perfect to be a natural crack. While Hale kept watch, his hand resting on the heavy crucifix hidden beneath his cassock, Daniel took out a thin, sharp chisel from his tool roll. He slid the blade into the hairline crack with the delicacy of a surgeon. With a soft, controlled pressure, he leveraged the tool. There was a faint click, the sound of a hidden spring releasing, and the section of paneling swung silently inward, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity cut deep into the wall. It was a void in the room's perfection, a space built for concealment. Reaching into the darkness of the hidden compartment, Hale's fingers brushed against the cool, smooth surface of tooled leather. He drew out a single, massive volume, far heavier than a normal book of its size. It was bound in black leather, without a title or any markings on its cover, but the quality was undeniable. The paper was thick vellum, the binding stitched with meticulous care. It had the heft and presence of a holy text, but it radiated a coldness that felt profoundly profane. Hale carried it to the desk and laid it under the lantern's beam, his hands trembling with a mixture of dread and vindication. Daniel stood over him, his shadow looming large. They both knew, without a doubt, that this was the object of their perilous quest. This was the altar upon which Blackwood recorded his heresies. With a deep breath that did little to steady his hands, Reverend Hale opened the book. The first page was not filled with numbers or patient names. Instead, it was covered in a flawless, elegant calligraphy, a preface to the horrors within. It was a philosophical manifesto, a chillingly lucid argument for a new kind of mercy. To prolong agony is not charity, but the cruelest form of vanity, Blackwood had written. The physician who fights a battle already lost, who subjects the flesh to torment for the sake of a few more wretched breaths, is the true monster. The highest form of healing is not the preservation of life, but the timely and graceful curation of its end. It was the confession of a man who did not see himself as a murderer, but as a messianic figure, a visionary liberating humanity from the tyranny of its own biology. They turned the page, and the true nature of the ledger was revealed. It was a meticulous, horrifying catalogue. Each page was dedicated to a single name: John Hemlock. Mariner, one entry began. Ailment, advanced stages of plague, necrotic buboes, intractable pain. Below this was a section titled Dosage for Definitive Peace, with a precise measurement listed: tincture of A, funestus, 4 drams, administered in water. Below that, a clinical observation: paralysis initiated within 90 seconds, cessation of respiration at 4 minutes, 12 seconds. Page after page contained the same cold formula, the same clinical detachment. They found the baker's sons, the seamstress, and finally, near the back, the entry that had driven them here: Eleanor Vance, age 22, recovering but psychically weakened. Dosage, 3 drams. A gentle dose, for a gentle soul. The most profane section of each entry was the final one, labeled Philosophical Reflection. Here, Blackwood's clinical tone vanished, replaced by a chilling, almost tender prose. Of the sailor, he wrote, his eyes, so used to the chaos of the sea, found a final, perfect calm. He understood the gift. For Eleanor, he wrote, she feared the return of pain more than the void. In her last moment, I saw not terror, but relief, a silent thank you. He never used the words kill or poison. He wrote of releasing, curing, and guiding. And on the inside cover, in a bold and arrogant script, he had given himself a title, the name he believed history should remember him by: Alistair Blackwood, the gentle hand of Thanatos. The sheer, methodical scale of his work was staggering, a secret genocide hidden beneath a veneer of compassion. As Hale's finger traced Eleanor's name, the fragile silence of the clinic was shattered. From the alley outside came a series of sounds, sharp and distinct, in the dead of night: the heavy clop of a horse, the groan of carriage springs, and then the definitive final click of a carriage door being shut. A lone set of footsteps, steady and unhurried, crunched on the gravel outside. They stopped directly in front of the clinic door. A key scraped against the iron lock, a loud grating sound that seemed to echo in the very bones of the two intruders. The lock tumbled, the handle turned. Blackwood was home. There was no time to run, no place to hide. They were caught in the sanctum of the beast, with his own confession open on the desk between them. The door swung open, and Dr. Blackwood stood silhouetted in the doorway, his own lantern held high. Its light fell upon Hale and Daniel, illuminating the open ledger on the desk, the desecrated heart of his secret world. For a long, silent moment, no one moved. The doctor's face, bathed in the warm lantern glow, registered no surprise, no anger, no fear. There was only a profound, almost weary disappointment, the look of a tutor whose prize student has failed a critical test. "Reverend," he said, his voice as calm and measured as if he were greeting Hale in a sunlit churchyard. "Daniel, I confess I am disappointed. I had hoped you would come to appreciate the beauty of my work without needing to tear it apart." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, sealing them in with him. He did not deny a thing. Walking slowly to his desk, he placed his lantern beside the open ledger, his movements betraying no sense of alarm. He looked at the book, then at the two men, and a faint, sad smile touched his lips. "You call it murder because you are slaves to the crude, biological impulse to live, no matter the cost," he explained, his tone that of a patient professor. "I have evolved beyond such sentiment. I see the body for what it is, a vessel. When the vessel is broken, cracked, and causing unbearable pain to the soul within, the only logical, the only merciful act is to help the soul depart." He gestured to the book. "This is not a record of death. It is a testament to liberation. I am the city's greatest healer, for I am the only one who dares to cure the incurable disease of suffering itself." Blackwood's gaze then fixed upon Reverend Hale, his eyes losing their philosophical detachment and taking on a cold, clinical intensity. "Your affliction, Reverend, is the most tragic of all, a sickness of the soul. You are plagued by doubt, by a fear of the divine responsibility that I have embraced." From the depths of his medical bag, his hand moved with a snake's speed, producing a familiar brass and glass syringe, the needle a silver sliver of light. "You fear true peace because you have never known it. Your God offers only a vague promise of it after death. I, on the other hand, can deliver it to you now." He took a menacing step forward, raising the syringe. "Let me cure you of your doubt. Let me give you the gift of perfect, silent understanding." He lunged, aiming the needle for Hale's neck. Before the needle could find purchase, a force of pure primal rage erupted from the shadows. Daniel Croft, silent until this moment, moved with the explosive power of a man who had nothing left to lose. He slammed into Blackwood with the force of a battering ram, throwing the doctor sideways. The syringe flew from Blackwood's hand, shattering against the far wall. What followed was not a duel, but a raw, brutal, and almost silent struggle. The doctor's precise, scientific movements were no match for the shipwright's brute strength, fueled by months of repressed grief and fury. The sounds of struggle were grunts, the thud of bodies against furniture, the frantic scrabbling for purchase. The fight ended with Blackwood on the floor, gasping for air, his mask of serene superiority finally shattered, leaving only a common, defeated man in its place. The horror was confirmed, and the gentle hand of Thanatos was finally in chains. The trial of Dr. Alistair Blackwood was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a theological spectacle, a desperate attempt by London's shell-shocked authorities to restore a semblance of divine and moral order. The charges were twofold: an extensive list of murders, substantiated by the chillingly detailed ledger and the damning testimonies of Hale and Croft. But it was the second charge that captivated the city: heresy. The prosecution, led by church officials eager to distance themselves from a man they had once lauded, argued that Blackwood's true crime was not the act of killing, but the profound arrogance of usurping a power belonging solely to God. He had not just ended lives, he had presumed to control the sacred moment of death itself, a transgression that horrified the 17th century mind, far more than simple poison. He stood accused of playing God, and his laboratory of mercy was reframed as a temple of blasphemy. Throughout the proceedings at the Old Bailey, Blackwood remained a figure of unshakable composure. He did not plead, he lectured, he did not ask for mercy, he offered justification. With the cold lucidity of a philosopher defending his life's work, he turned the courtroom into his final classroom, articulating his belief that he was not a criminal but a pioneer. He spoke of suffering as the true evil, and of his definitive cure as the only rational and compassionate response. To the jury's horrified faces, he described their attachment to life as a primitive fear, a biological flaw he had transcended. His confession was absolute, delivered not with the guilt of a murderer, but with the profound conviction of a Messiah who had been tragically misunderstood by the very people he had sought to save. His lack of remorse was his most damning evidence. The city of London fractured under the weight of his testimony. For the majority, the revelation of his methods, the silent, conscious suffocation, solidified his image as a monster of unimaginable cruelty, a demon disguised as a healer. The moniker, the merciful doctor, became a bitter curse on the lips of the public. Yet, a disquieting undercurrent of dissent flowed silently through the city's veins. The families of his many victims, those who had witnessed the peaceful end of an unbearable agony, remained conspicuously silent. In hushed conversations, behind closed doors, a secret and shameful gratitude persisted. For every person who saw Blackwood as a fiend, there was another who secretly remembered him as the only one who offered a release from the relentless torment of the plague. This unbridgeable divide became a permanent scar on the city's collective memory. Predictably, the verdict was swift and absolute: guilty on all counts of murder, and most damningly, guilty of heresy. Dr. Alistair Blackwood was sentenced to die at the Tyburn gallows, the fate of the common murderer, a public spectacle designed to cleanse the city of his stain and violently reassert the boundaries he had so arrogantly crossed. The sentence was not merely a punishment but a piece of public theater, a brutal sermon delivered in rope and wood. The authorities needed London to witness the fall of this false god, to see his body hang limp and powerless, a definitive, physical rebuttal to his philosophy of a controlled, painless end. His execution was to be the ultimate proof that the power over life and death remained firmly in the hands of God and the state. His final journey was a spectacle of silence. The customary jeering and taunting that accompanied the cart ride to Tyburn were absent. Instead, a vast, somber crowd lined the route, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, fear, and a strange, lingering awe. They watched as the man who had offered a quietus to so many was taken to his own noisy and public end. Upon the gallows, with a noose around his neck, he was offered a final chance to repent. He refused. Surveying the sea of faces below, his expression was not one of fear, but of a profound and unnerving pity. It was the look of a shepherd gazing upon a lost flock. His last act was not a plea for his own soul, but a silent judgment upon a world he deemed too weak to accept his terrible gift. Then, the cart pulled away, and the merciful doctor was no more. In the aftermath, his clinic on Cheapside became a monument to his crimes. Officially seized by the Crown, the building was left to rot, too infamous to be sold, too horrifying to be repurposed. The meticulous order of his study was consumed by dust and decay, the shelves of books warped by damp, the gleaming instruments left to rust. It became a dead zone in the heart of the city, a place children dared each other to touch, a landmark of urban dread. The stories began almost immediately, whispers of a persistent cold spot in the alley, of a profound and unnatural silence that seemed to emanate from the boarded-up windows. Blackwood's silence, a phenomenon that was now, for all intents and purposes, considered real. The building was no longer a clinic. It was a tombstone for an idea. As years turned into decades, the historical man, Alistair Blackwood, dissolved into the mythical figure of the merciful doctor. His complex philosophy was simplified into a chilling ghost story, his ledger and trial forgotten in favor of a more elemental tale of a physician who killed with a gentle touch. The legend claimed the clinic was haunted not by screaming phantoms, but by the placid, silent ghosts of his victims. They were said to wander the ruins, their expressions serene, forever trapped in the final, terrifying moments of their conscious paralysis. a state of death so unnatural that it had untethered them from the normal cycle of rest. The horror of the legend lay not in violence, but in its quiet, eternal stillness, a perfect reflection of the doctor's methods. Today, if you navigate the labyrinthine alleys of modern London, you can still find the spot where the clinic once stood. It is nothing more than a small, empty plot of land, paved over and forgotten, wedged between a coffee shop and a modern office building. The ruins are gone, but the story persists, kept alive by tour guides who spin the tale of the merciful doctor for fascinated tourists. The narrative often concludes a few miles away, at the Museum of London. There, behind the sterile safety of a glass display case, lies the final remnant of Alistair Blackwood's legacy, a set of his strange or continental instruments, rusted and inert. They are presented as historical artifacts, their terrible purpose reduced to a small brass plaque that reads, simply, Physician's Tools, CE, 1665. The horror of Dr. Blackwood's story is not that he was a monster, but that he was a man driven by a philosophy, a logic so twisted it perfectly mirrored compassion. His instruments, now silent in their museum case, are a testament to how easily the line between healer and executioner can blur, how quickly the noble quest to end suffering can become a monstrous assertion of power. His victims, recorded with such precision in his ledger, were not just entries in a catalog of death. They were the human price of a perfect, terrible idea. His legacy reminds us that the darkest parts of our history are not always the products of mindless evil, but often of a terrifying, reasoned clarity that sees humanity as a problem to be solved. The line between mercy and monstrosity is often written in fading ink, and history has a habit of sanitizing its most complex demons into simple cautionary tales. These stories, yet in their full disturbing detail, are the archives of our darkest moral questions, and they must be preserved. To ensure that these chilling chapters of the human story are never flattened into myth or forgotten behind museum glass, subscribe and help us keep the unlit corridors of the past open for all who dare to walk them.